It's not an outrageous thing to say that over the past couple of years, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or the MCU, has received somewhat of a mixed reputation. With the release of Deadpool and Wolverine, I thought I would take on the Herculean task and rewatch every MCU film, and yes, even those ones, and rank them on a tier list starting with S all the way down to F, to answer the age-old question of, was the MCU ever good? Were we conned from the beginning? What has the man with the baseball hat done to us? Obviously, my opinions are very stupid, and if you disagree with me, let me know in the comments, because I'm sure a lot of you definitely will, and I'll respond to you and we can have a little chat about it. Maybe, unless you're personally attacking me and I get upset. Surely this isn't difficult at all, right? It took a little bit longer than I expected. Did I grow facial hair out for 4 weeks just for a 2-second joke? Yes. Does it look terrible? Yes. Are you going to have to put up with it for the rest of the video? Yes. Spoiler warning. I'm not going to be spoiling the plot of Deadpool and Wolverine because that's just come out. But for the remaining 33 Marvel movies stretching from Iron Man all the way up to the Marvels, I'm going to be spoiling the plots of them somewhat. Iron Man is just your run-of-the-mill story of a cocky, sexist, alcoholic weapons manufacturer named Tony Stark, who, after being kidnapped, is brutally forced to come to terms with his own livelihood. Before watching any of these films, I made my own tier list ranking where I remembered each of them in my own brain, and I think I might have made a little bit of a whoopsie. So I've just finished Iron Man 1, and I truly don't know why I ranked that as low as I did in my initial ranking. That was good. The sheer fact that Robert Downey Jr. manages to inhale a whopper in the middle of a scene puts that immediately at the top of the ranking. Don't get me wrong, this film has some of the trappings of what makes an MCU movie an MCU movie. I mean, where do you think they got it from? They have a big CGI battle on top of a building. Get used to me saying that sentence from here on out. Oh yeah, and Tony definitely has this above-board relationship that definitely isn't a dodgy misuse of power with his assistant Pepper Potts. And at the end, a dude with an eye patch shows up and says the call word.
Avenger initiative.
But in terms of making people feel sympathy for truly a horrendous person, who in full sincerity called their superhero suit Iron Man, this film deserves an insane amount of credit. The Incredible Hulk. Oh my god, do I have to do this? Bruce Banner has had to relocate his life to the favelas of Brazil as he's had a little bit of a whoopsie with some gamma radiation. He's finally found by the true villain of this story, the US government. And I mean, why would you be shocked? He turns into a big green thing and stomps around a bit. All the while, the CGI is totally not creepy and definitely stands up in 2024. Just don't look at his feet. Somehow he hitchhikes his way all the way from Brazil to America just in time to see Phil Dunphy kissing his ex-girlfriend before she totally ditches him to get back with our big green friend after seeing his face for like 5 seconds. Tim Roth has drawn on abs, and as punishment for that, gets kicked into a tree at 5,000 miles an hour. In the beginning, Banner was on the run, his ex-girlfriend was pining after him, and the US government were mad after an experiment went awry. And at the end, Banner is on the run, his ex-girlfriend is pining after him, and the US government are mad after an experiment went awry. The only thing that is different is this man's head is now big, and this guy has terrible posture. But as a side note, I thought Ed Norton and Liv Tyler were great. They're just left down by the writing, direction, sound effects, and storytelling, and pretty much everything else in the movie. It is bad, but it's not as bad as I thought it would be. F. This time, I'm going to be a bit more mobile because I need to vent about this. Iron Man 2 follows along from the rip-roaring success that was its predecessor in the exact place that we all expected it would do. In a dimly lit apartment in the middle of Russia. Here we learn that this old fellow called Anton Vanko was a former Stark employee who was rudely pushed to the side because of Tony Stark's father. And also he helped construct the arc reactor, the thing that keeps Tony from having shrapnel shooting into his heart. And now we have to watch on as his son Ivan watches his father perish away without a penny to his name and unknown to the world. See, that is how you build up a story. In the first film, Tony has to literally face the repercussions of how he's made a name for himself in the world, leaving him with actual scars he can never recover from. But now, skipping forward a few months, he is at the height of his powers and is once again blindsided and forced to look inwards and come to terms with the legacy of his family name, and more specifically, the sins of his father. This concept is not only materialised in the form of the actual villain of the film, Ivan Vanko or Whiplash, but additionally Tony is continuing to struggle with the creation made by his and Vanko's fathers, the arc reactor. The palladium core is slowly poisoning him, setting up this nice dichotomy between ignoring your father's past discretions, a move that could literally kill him, or come to terms with with it in a head-on confrontation with Whiplash, a move that could also kill him. But again, I don't remember Whiplash 2, Time for More Whips, doing that well at the box office. For some truly baffling reason, all the progress that Tony made in that first film has been absolutely retconned, like its name was Terrence Howard. Tony is still a creep, his ego is absolutely ballooned in size, and he's become truly insufferable, which is understandable as everyone now sees him as some sort of Messianic deity with a neat goatee. With this only being furthered at the end of the movie, when he makes a whole new element. Like, what? How are we supposed to relate with that? Well, actually, you could say his dad discovered this new element because he left the blueprints for it in a model village, which is just weird in of itself. He neglected Tony throughout his entire life, but the one thing he left from him, apart from the company and all his wealth, I guess, just happens to be the one element that allows him to continue being a metal man without poisoning. How? This also completely negates all the cool stuff that's set up in the beginning about Tony and his father's legacy being poisonous and also literally poisoning him. Because who cares if your dad shipped someone off to Siberia? He made a new element. Turns out it doesn't matter how many people you screw over on your way to the top, as long as you create cool stuff. Wow, I guess this really is an analogy for Elon Musk. Additionally, it works well within a narrative framework for in the inevitable confrontation between him and Whiplash, for Whiplash to pull the rug out from underneath Tony as he confronts him about the sins of his father. Except, that does not happen! When they first meet in Monaco, they have this insanely weird stare-off where Whiplash just scythes through his car without saying a single word. It's more like a weird mating ritual that you'd see a strange-looking bird would have on National Geographic. You later find out that the reason Vanko wanted to whoop Tony so hard out in the public space was that so the general public could see a god bleed, which again is inherently a very cool angle. But why, with that being said, does that have absolutely no bearing on the rest of the story? Let me remind you, he makes an element. He's clearly doing fine. In the end, the only time Tony is explicitly told, oh, hang on, did you know that Whiplash's dad got messed up by your dad? Is by this dude with an eye patch from the last movie. I guess because they needed a contractual use for him as they need to set up an overarching narrative. But why ignore the villain? Why have you spent the entire introduction setting up this cool thing if it's never going to pay off with the character there? Oh yeah, Black Widow's in this film too. And so is Elon Musk. Oh yeah. Another abhorrent thing with this movie before I forget about this is just how genuinely awful Tony is in interactions with any women throughout the entirety of the movie. No more is this epitomised than his first interaction with Black Widow, who at this point we assume to be Natalie Rushman, an assistant that's going to replace Pepper now that she's CEO. Obviously, we know she's something else because she's Scarlett Johansson and she's on the poster. But Tony obviously doesn't know who Scarlett Johansson is. He clearly hasn't seen Fly Me to the Moon. Yet within 5 seconds of meeting her, both Tony and Happy simultaneously manage to somehow belittle her, undermine her, and just continue to be super weird around her the entire time. That's like a Tate Brothers hat trick right there. Tony even goes on to say, I want one. And Pepper gives him this, oh, you little rascal look. Like that's not an insanely grotesque thing to say to someone. Pepper even makes a joke about her being
a very expensive sexual harassment lawsuit if you keep ogling her like that.
Do you understand how gross of a person you have to be that when you first interact with someone, your close friend says that about you? Like he does it so often and it's such a common occurrence in his life that before he says anything, they're like, yep, I'm getting this joke out there right away. I understand Tony is supposed to be this flawed hero. His whole existence is propped up with the wealth of his father and the fact that he's always been this super insane super genius. But how is that not insanely insufferable? He's on to his second movie and he's still an idiot. It's time to move away from the sexism as Vanko gets broken out of prison by Tony's dim-witted rival, Justin Hammer, played by the always incredible Sam Rockwell, who, along with Don Cheadle, are the two absolute highlights of this film. And then a massive CGI battle ensues in a bland, nondescript location with robots that wouldn't look out of place in the Valorant practice arena. For some reason, Whiplash gets a big Iron Man suit, even though he was doing completely fine as a normal man. I guess Marvel just needed to release more toys that Christmas. Obviously, Tony and Rhodey easily defeat all the robots because they are boring robots, but then out of nowhere, oh no, the robots become bombs and there's like an arbitrary countdown to save Pepper. But, oh, okay, that's also easily dealt with. Well, the movie's over now, you can leave. But he said Avengers! Everything's okay! This is by far and away one of the worst movies I've seen in the past few years, and I just watched The Incredible Hulk like moments before this. To sum up my general feelings for this film, here's what I've written in my notes. The start was bad, the middle bit was pointless, and the ending was awful. So yeah, I think it deserves its place firmly at the bottom of our list. In fact, I think it's going to get a new category all of its own. I hope no other films join it in the near future. God, I'm genuinely already knackered and I've watched
3 films out of a potential 33.
Thor tells the story of 2 children of the Norse god, but not really the Norse god Odin, that are just absolutely gagging to take over the throne of a little place called Asgard. After doing a big whoopsie and accidentally starting a war with these big blue things called frost giants in a big CGI battle that happens at the start of the movie for once, that is progress as far as I'm considered. Thor and his magic hammer get booted to the last place on Earth a big muscly man from an ethereal plane would want to go. New Mexico. And Thor takes a visit to Nutland. Don't forget about that. I know it's Donut Land, but don't take the illusion away from me. This film is okay, I guess. There are actually long swaths of it where I was sitting there thinking, am I actually watching a movie right now? Before I was greeted by exposition dump after exposition dump, like the film was lactose intolerant and still continued to just gorge on Ben & Jerry's. It's very Marvel. Like, it has insanely cool elements, but they're just dragged down with a story that does too many things at once, and they're all done very stupidly. I do also find it insanely stupid just how trusting everyone is of this big blonde muscly man they find in the middle of a field. Like, I know he's a hunk, but why are you letting him draw all over your life's work whilst letting him waffle about the 9 realms and the world's tree? Everyone just accepts this as a total fact so fast. These are supposed to be people of science. It's absolutely a breath of fresh air not to just have a big stupid CGI battle with a robot at the end of each film. What? It's right behind me, isn't it? Why was Marvel so obsessed with insanely bland robots being the villains of every film? The only one that doesn't have them was the Hulk, and that was retconned. Thinking of things done stupidly, why did you waste Idris Elba on this role? The man with a weird helmet and a sword. For that alone, this film gets a D. Next. Captain America, the first Avenger.
Spoiler alert, World War II is afoot. God, how typical. Those darn Europeans are doing what they always do and steal a bunch of artifacts that are totally not cursed with unlimited power. But don't fret, old bean, America is on the way. More specifically, this one tiny hopeless little loser called Steve Rogers, who, if you haven't noticed, you silly chap, has rather biffed it and missed the boat on puberty. But unlike the rest of us who had to tough it out in the trenches to wait to be tall enough to ride the big rides at Alton Towers, this man used a little magical thing called government intervention.
I can't do this accent anymore. After finding out one of his best buds called Bucky has been captured, opposed to doing what soldiers do and work together, he decides to do his ingenious plan of just parachuting right into their base and beating everybody up. Oh yeah, and this German guy takes off his face. Steve looks completely unfazed by that. But what's even weirder than that though is after rescuing everybody, he walks back to the base that he was at from Austria. Do Americans not know how big Europe is? Bucky falls from a train, Steve is sad and beats up the red-faced man so bad he disappears into the artifact. And I've got to be honest, I still teared up at this bit. Don't laugh at me. This film was way, way better than I remember, but that could have just been because it was an absolute change in formula to the nightmares I'd already been witnessing. There was actual character growth, the romance angle was actually good for once, and the hero wasn't an ass. And the post-credit scene still blew my mind, even as much as it did when I was a tiny little child watching it for the first time. The sheer fact that it didn't have a big CGI battle with a robot at the end instantly puts it near the top of the list. But then again, it didn't have a section where Chris Evans just absolutely houses a Burger King Whopper, so it gets a B. Also, I feel like I just want to tell you, because I need to get this information out of me. Chris Evans wore big fake feet in this scene. Here's an image. There was no reason, I just wanted to tell you. The Avengers. This is it. 4 years of build-up for this once-in-a-lifetime cinematic event that now happens every few years. But this was the first time. It was quite a big movement. Loki is still gagging for the throne after the first Thor film and now wants to take over Earth because his brother loves it so much. Pokemon Shield activate the Avengers initiative and bring together all the super-powered people that we know, like Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, the Hulk on Ozempic, the woman who pretended to be an assistant in Iron Man 2, and the man who is hired to stand in the rain with a bow and arrow in Thor, who also happens to get mind control within 5 minutes of the film. Truly the best of the best. They hate each other, they love each other, they hate each other again. Loki removes someone's eye from their head, which I completely forgot about. They put aside their differences and stop the evil aliens from taking New York. And everybody cheers in the end, including Ashley Johnson from Critical Role, who is also here. This film falls prey to a peculiar little thing called the Iron Man conundrum, which, if you aren't familiar with the phrase I just made up on the spot, it has 2 facets. One being that due to the immense success of Iron Man, this was always going to have to be an Iron Man film, no matter what happened. Even if that comes at the detriment for actual growth for the characters that we don't know about. Why is this actor completely different? Is no one else seeing this? It's really stupid. And secondly, because of the sheer cultural and economic chokehold this film had over us, it has some incredibly favourable reviews. Sure, you might see some cool clips of 30-second parts going around on Twitter at the moment, but do you remember the bit where they're like trying to prove to us that Hawkeye's like super cool and menacing when he's just a dude with a bow and arrow and a waistcoat? Or just the insane amount of like governmental nonsense spoken by Robin from How I Met Your Mother and the guy with the eye patch? Because when I rock up to a once-in-a-lifetime cinematic crossover event, I really want to hear about governmental red tape and bureaucratic struggles. Aside from that, and don't get angry, it's a pretty basic sci-fi movie, complete with all the staples from the 2010s, like a bunch of aliens that desperately want Earth but can speak perfect English. It also continues to use that typical patriotic, inspiring mumbo-jumbo that we're used to, like where the aliens are like, those pesky humans are so weak and we are so strong. With that being said though, and also ignoring the absolutely abhorrent man who helmed this film, it does a pretty good job of melding together a lot of different styles and dialects from all these different films and putting these characters from the page to the screen works better, whilst offering some characters the actual chance to progress, and by some characters I mean Iron Man. That being said though, there are still some incredibly weird things in this film, like everything that happens to Scarlett Johansson again. And also, this isn't a sweeping remark to anyone that's from this place, but why are the people of New York so stupid in this film? Like, you can see aliens are crashing through skyscrapers and yet they stand about this far away from glass. Get a hot dog and go home? Am I simply built different for thinking that? But aside from that, it's going in at C. Next. And with that, we've managed to come to the end of phase 1. You may think I've been harsh with the ratings so far, but come on, some of them are pretty rough. I can understand the nostalgia lenses for some of these because they were the first of their kind and they were trying to get a bunch of people unfamiliar with the world invested in it, but they're still a little bit ropey. There's just a few things that I think Marvel need to tweak going forwards. Firstly, please can we stop having the villains of the films being big CGI robots? Like, please do something different. Secondly, stop with the boring, nondescript science lingo. I don't need to know how these readings are off the scale. What scale even is that? The scale of how much I should care? Because it's very much 0. And finally, and this is quite a big one that I haven't spoken about yet, in Avengers there's a pretty weird scene where Gwyneth Paltrow's got her trotters out. Why? Why are her feet out? Why would the director go, you know what would make this scene better? If Gwyneth Paltrow's in some really short shorts and has got her dogs out. Why? If I wanted to see dogs running free, I'd go and watch Crufts. Phase 2 blasts onto our screens with a long-awaited follow-up to the film that haunted my dreams last night. Iron Man 3 picks up right where we left off in the Avengers movie and Tony actually has to face repercussions for his actions. Sound the alarm, it's happened. It starts off in 1999 with Tony being even more insufferable than usual as he absolutely blanks a dude called Aldrich Killian so he can go and talk to that girl over there. Psst, this guy's the villain of the film. On top of all of that, Tony now has to live with the fact that he stared into the literal void of space, and also aliens are now real, which would rattle anyone's brain. Tony actually experiences some sort of growth in this film, so after the last horror show, that actually deserves some points. It's not as good as the first film by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, there's no Burger King brand deals in sight. But there are some cool callbacks to the first film, such as when he actually has to use his big fat brain, again, like he did when he was in a cave building something out of a box of scraps, which is quite cool. And then Pepper actually deals the finishing blow, so I guess that's different, so bonus points for you. Also, this film finally does something that I've been desperately calling out for, so quickly, let's have a sidebar. One of the major criticisms that I level towards Marvel and MCU movies that I haven't really mentioned so far is the idea of how Marvel approaches giving away information to its audience. For instance, in the Avengers, we're supposed to come on board with the idea that this big glowy scepter thing is super evil. But how do we find out this information? A big boring sciencey explanation, of course, opposed to having us experience it in the moment by, like, I don't know, having it wreck a bunch of superheroes that we've become intimately familiar with. We're given a quick Spark Notes description just so Marvel knows that we know what we're waffling about before having it demolish a few extras and new people that we don't even know who they are. And this happens in almost every movie. It is infuriating. Iron Man 3, however, decides to break this trend with the director Shane Black employing the tactic of showing and not telling, which I'm sure if any of you have done any form of creative writing, you've had that shouted at you by a teacher at some point. But it's quite important, and that's coming from someone who got an English degree in Wales. Around the 1 hour 40 mark, Tony and Rhodey have just escaped being captured and have pieced together that the nerdy guy Killian is super evil and that his invention, called Extremis, is helping people with amputations grow back limbs. But in a slight whoopsie, if the body chooses to reject it, you're turned into a ticking time bomb. I know there's a lot of plot that I glossed over. So to make make sure this information gets passed along the right channels, Rhodey phones up the Vice President and lets him know. We assume all is well, but then after they hang up, we sit there and watch as the Vice President walks over to his child, kisses them on the head, and it pans down, revealing his child's missing limb. We now know he's working with Killian and we can put the dots together in our brain, and I understand how ironic it is that I had to explain that to you. Could you see how much cooler that is though? Okay, rant over. Iron Man 3 gets a solid C. On to the next one. Thor: The Dark World is by far and away one of the absolute worst films on this list. There's a reason it's nearly at the bottom of every single ranking released by pretty much everybody. It's so bad that I'm not even giving it a quick plot synopsis and some quippy jokes, and I'm not even putting footage of the film behind me. To sum up how bad this film is, I will utter one sentence. Christopher Eccleston, who is the main villain of this film, does not speak English until minute 47. 47. And you know what? It's so bad, it's so utterly abhorrent that it's even bad at being a bad film. So as punishment for its crimes, it can serve time sitting next to Iron Man 2. It sucks. Next. Captain America: The Winter Soldier is absolutely one of the films I remember most fondly from this era, and I've got to say, gladly, it still holds up. Unlike Tony, it seems Steve Rogers is absolutely thriving after being brought back to life to fight a bunch of goofy looking aliens. He's going on runs, he's making a new friend called Sam, he's watching a bunch of movies, he's potentially going on dates, but wow. And in his spare time infiltrating a secret government base to tackle some French and Algerian pirates. He's loving life. You may think I'm sassing the film, but I'm British, this is how I talk. This film is absolutely incredible, and if I could, I'd spend an entire video probably waffling about it, but there are many, many other films that we need to get to, so I'm sort of picking up the pace from this point. What makes this film rip so hard is that opposed to sticking to the formula of being a big blockbustery sci-fi action film with many explosions and special effects, The Winter Soldier manages to tick all those boxes on what we would expect from a Marvel movie, whilst also trying some new things, such as letting the MCU dip its toe into an entirely new genre, that of a Cold War spy thriller. I know that there's that Scorsese quote that always gets thrown about when people talk about the MCU, about how they're always like cookie cutter action romps, but this absolutely rips and manages to tell a compelling story with human emotions weaved throughout, whilst also having a lot of big muscly men explode some helicarriers. This rockets into S tier, and I have a feeling we might be here for a little bit.
I think the mental whiplash my brain has just endured from quickly finishing Thor: The Dark World and then immediately watching Captain America: The Winter Soldier needs to be studied as intensively as they are studying the Tesseract, because something's going on up here.
Guardians of the Galaxy sees the dramatic U-turn its predecessor took from the traditional formula of MCU movie making and turns that up to around 1,000, transitioning from the boring, realistic CGI fest that we're all used to a Fast and Furious style Noz-injected Tokyo Drift. Rather than sticking with stinky human stories on Earth, James Gunn's first foray into the world of comic book movies decides to take a step back and focus on the wider galaxy as a whole. What's truly incredible about this film upon a rewatch is that it's not only a very, very good film, but it's so pivotal for the entirety of the MCU going forward. Like, it introduces so many different things. We get our first proper look and traditional exposition dump around these things called the Infinity Stones. We're introduced to new worlds and new characters beyond our own that finally show us, the viewing public, that you don't have to be American to be a superhero. You can be a tree. And it even gives a voice to Thanos. Yeah, the purple dude, he's in this.
I completely forgot about that. He's even got the same voice. What the hell? I forgot about that.
Before rewatching all of these, I sort of had Guardians towards the top of B, and I now understand how absolutely abhorrent that was of me, and I'm very sorry. It absolutely canons to the top of S tier. 2 S tier films in a row, surely that's a trend and every film from here on out is good, right? Avengers Age of Ultron finally asked the question that we've all been waiting to hear the answer for. How would Earth's mightiest heroes fare against some CGI robots? What? Again? Why are there so many robots? You know, for all the slack that this film gets, I did actually sit throughout the opening 30 minutes and think I was actually watching a movie and not an Xbox 360 tech demo. It starts with the Avengers just wrecking shop through a Hydra base, complete with all the quippy one-liners and team-ups that we're now all accustomed to. Throw in 2 new superpowered people in the form of the Maximoff twins Wanda and Pietro, add in a few spooky visions into the future, and it makes for a super fun watch. Bruce and Tony decide to then transform into 2024 tech bros and become overly obsessed with AI and accidentally end up creating a narcissistic megalomaniac called Ultron who wants to bring peace in our time by just wiping out all of humanity. This scene is quite cool, but don't get used to that feeling because we're about to take a sharp left turn into what the hell is going on town with a prominent theme that is rearing its ugly head once again. Why has Robin from How I Met Your Mother got her plates of meat out? And okay, I'm gonna be honest with you, I did not know plates of meat meant feet. I'm not the weird one here, Google is. Blame them, not me. Why are her dogs out again? What does that possibly add to this scene? This sort of marks the beginning of the end for the film. Here it becomes a regular who's who of traditional MCU movie tropes. Clint Barton being useless? Tick. First battle against the villain where no one really wins? Tick. High intensity chase sequence where the heroes obviously come out on top and then the villain gets super evil but continues with his master plan anyway? Tick. A weird mix of comedy and severity coming out the mouth of someone who is supposed to inherently fear from minute one? Tick. For some reason, what we're led to believe is an incredibly super intelligent being who has access to every piece of information he could possibly want. His master plan just involves throwing a city at the Earth, and obviously the Avengers stop it really easily because it's an incredibly stupid plan. Double tick. It also continues with a very alarming tradition that's starting to rear its head again, and no, it's not people showing feet for free, but it's how the MCU deals with Scarlett Johansson. I know I've already waffled about this, but in terms of creepy character development, this is sort of when it reaches the pinnacle. For some incredible reason that's never actually explained, Natasha and Banner suddenly are now a thing, and their explanation for that is,
I still think you're the only monster on the team.
eh? The only reason this film exists, in my opinion, is for four things. One is to introduce us to Wanda, Pietro, and Vision. Two, the Avengers have to absolutely level Sokovia in order for future events to happen. Three, Thor had to have this weird half-naked vision with the man from Mamma Mia watching on as he explicitly says what Infinity Stones are, just in case people didn't listen to Guardians of the Galaxy. And four, Joss Whedon wanted to look at people's feet again. It's very weird. D. Ant-Man. If Ant-Man has 1 million fans, I'm one of them. If Ant-Man has one fan, that fan is me. If Ant-Man has no fans, that means I've fallen into a rage-induced coma after watching Iron Man 2 one too many times. If you couldn't tell by now, I absolutely love Ant-Man. It's one of the MCU films that I'll absolutely die in every hell imaginable for. I mean, Paul Rudd is normal-sized, and then he's not. How could you not fall in love with that concept? Whoever decided the cast for this film alone needs to get a Nobel Peace Prize. Paul Rudd, Luis Pena, Judy Greer, David Dasmalchian, Michael Douglas playing a man who's obsessed with ants. Sign me up! Just like Guardians of the Galaxy, Ant-Man is a perfect blend of family fun with sort of weird hints in the background to an incredibly nefarious thing going on, like that bald dude who's just crushing a lot of sheep and then gets reduced to an atom in was actually quite a horrifying death. The best thing about it is how it never takes itself too seriously, and I mean, who in their right mind would involve Ant-Man in a film where you increase the stakes dramatically, remove all the heart and fun from it, just to try and introduce the villain that nobody really likes? That's not going to happen, is it? The only reason this film doesn't canon to the top of the S tier for me is because Marvel absolutely fumbled the bag and let Edgar Wright go, who was initially supposed to helm the film. And you can absolutely see his DNA all over this film. So it's going to the top of A for now.
So with that, Ant-Man is complete. 12 films are down, and now we're on to the big boy. Phase 3. Between 2008 and 2015, Marvel released 12 films, the ones we've just covered so far.
But between 2013 and 2019, Marvel releases 17 movies. 17! And look how much is left of the video, and look how long we've got so far. Please help.
I think for my own sanity here, we need to switch up how we're doing this so far, because this is quickly becoming my entire personality. Just to give you an insight into my personal life, and when this was all filmed, England just beat Slovakia at the Euros, which is something I'm sure none of you care about. But the reason I mention it is because I've been watching so much Marvel in such a short span of time that when I was talking to my friend about the football, I said England beat Sokovia. Who would they even put on the field? Would they put Wanda and Pietro down the wing? What is happening to me?
If you couldn't tell, this was all getting to me somewhat. So far, it's been relatively straightforward to keep up with this all because it's the same batch of characters going on goofy hijinks together. But with the inclusion of Ant-Man, no matter how much I love him, things are about to start getting a little bit more complicated. So from here on out, instead of doing a quick plot recap followed by my quippy remarks and me saying where I'm ranking it on my tier list, I'm fully just going to have to say what I think of the film, because look how long we've been going so far. I, in real time, have been recording for 1 hour 45 minutes, and I still have 22 films left. 22! I did this video because I thought it was going to be a nice change of pace from doing a video essay. I originally planned to watch all the TV shows too. What is wrong with me? Captain America Civil War. Okay, I've got to admit something stupid now. In my tier list in which I ranked all the movies before watching them again, I did put Captain America Civil War quite low. Sorry about that. Unless D stood for definitely go and watch this, I need to have my brain studied by medical professionals. Civil War is absolutely a masterclass in filmmaking and incinerates any credibility in anyone who says MCU just make boring, big, boomy blockbusters. I mean, some of them are that, but this one definitely isn't. Fresh off the immense success of The Winter Soldier, Marvel decided to assemble the gang together again, and by that I mean the Russo brothers, Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely. Looking at that joint filmography makes me McFeely very good. That's just not good. Remember when I said this about the Avengers film? Because when I rock up to a once-in-a-lifetime cinematic crossover event, I really want to hear about governmental red tape and bureaucratic struggles. Well, that's basically the whole plot of this film, and it absolutely rips. But with all of that, instead of this just being another Captain America film, which I absolutely would have loved anyway, this is basically the third Avengers film. They're all here. This even introduces the Avengers to that little known freak called Ant-Man. Yeah, Paul Rudd's in this one. I guess Black Panther and Spider-Man are here too, but Paul Rudd! However, even with all of that, and with this absolutely stacked cast, and with the responsibility of introducing such titanic figures in Marvel lore as T'Challa and Spidey, you'd think it'd feel a little bit bloated, but it doesn't. Unlike many modern MCU films that we're going to get onto, the cameos actually advance the story forward and put obstacles for our titular characters to deal with. Whereas The Winter Soldier was the MCU dipping its toe into a new genre, Civil War absolutely submerges it and brings a level of realism to the Marvel world that you wouldn't expect, considering there's a big red dude with a yellow crystal in his head. What makes this film so goddamn impressive is how it forces us to use our big dumb heads for once and think. There is a world where you could come out of this and be angry with Captain America. That would be the right world to be in, but he's like the title of the film. That should be illegal. Another thing in this film that should be illegal is that the actual villain of this film, Baron Zemo, accomplishes his goal, and there's not a big CGI battle that he has. He's not in a robot suit, like once in the film. This film is so good and I haven't even mentioned the scene where Captain America and Bucky fight Iron Man. It's so good. Without a shadow of doubt, this film is towards the top of S tier, and I agree with that as much as I agree with Tony, because he was right all along. Listen to the man in the iron suit. Doctor Strange. Let's be completely honest. A film with the title Doctor Strange, based around a magical wizard with a goatee who has a sentient cape and travels to a place called the Mirror Dimension, should not slap as hard as this film does. I remember watching it the day after a night out when I was at university, and I definitely wasn't still intoxicated, and my tiny little mind was absolutely blown by it. I do always forget as well how incredibly unlikable Strange is at the start. What I think makes this film stand out so much for me amongst the dross that I've seen so far is how against the wider MCU, this film is pretty weird, and I do like weird. I mean, look at me. All the Mirror Dimension chase sequences are a delight to watch. The first scene where Strange goes into his astral form is incredible, and the last scene where he just keeps dying over and over again. That's super fun. And again, if you couldn't tell by now, every time a rogue British person shows up in the MCU, I sort of feel a connection with them. So, into the A it goes, which now I'm saying out loud definitely sounds weird. Ignore that as we go on to Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Okay, please be reasonable with me here, but I'm going to say something that a lot of you may not like. Personally, I do not like this film. Put the pitchfork down, Jeremy. Let me talk. Don't get me wrong. Watching this again, there are still some scenes that rip the very heart out of me. Like the scene where Ego reveals that he's killed Peter's mother, or Yondu's sacrificing his "he may have been your father, boy, but he wasn't your daddy" line. That's just great. I do remember adoring it the first time I watched, and I mean, look where I put it on my original tier list. It's quite high up. But if we look at it from a purely narrative perspective, which is an angle I'm forced to look at most things, it's quite boring. You have all the cool stuff at the start with the Sovereign and they battle with the Aboleth, then a cool fight scene where more goofs and gaffs occur before they crash on another planet. All is looking good so far. Sure, you have the scenes with Rocket and the gang goofing away with Taserface where they just straight up Home Alone all the Ravagers, which is super fun again, and again, the soundtrack, very good. But then when you cut back to the gang on Ego, it's so painfully slow. One of the reasons I think it feels a little bit bland is that they're never really in any mortal danger whilst they're on Ego, and I know later on we find out that they are, because Ego is a big evil man, but there's never really any inciting incidents in the A-plot that drive the story forward in any way. Maybe I've just been conditioned to the Marvel boom boom machine, and because there's not a bunch of explosions the whole time, I find it really boring. That's probably what's happening here. Weirdly enough, as I'm standing here with a hurting throat, It's quite similar to one of James Gunn's other films, Scooby-Doo. A gang of 5 people are lured to a mysterious island. One of them has a weird heart-to-heart with who we later find out is one of the villain's accomplices. There's a weird dance break in the middle. At the heart of it, there's a weird eccentric man who's secretly something else entirely. The only difference is Rocket doesn't wear a dress and a hat. I'm putting it in C. Spider-Man Homecoming. After being utterly heartbroken by my experience with Guardians of the Galaxy 2, I went into this absolutely petrified, cowering behind my sofa as I slowly pressed play. Because if a Spider-Man movie wasn't good, I don't know what I'd do with myself. From an outside perspective, it seems absolutely insane to me that in order to cure an overwhelming sense of superhero fatigue, they decided to reboot one of the most rebooted superheroes in existence. But boy, was I shot into the stratosphere by this. In comparison to the cinematic releases that came before it, I think Homecoming's one of the most visually distinct. It also helps this film stand out in the wider MCU, as although the Avengers and Iron Man are referenced heavily throughout, they're not like integral to the film. Sure, Tony is there to be like a fatherly figure towards Spider-Man and Peter Parker. Robert Downey Jr. doesn't have a scene explicitly where he says, "Kid, go and look after the Vulture." His stark rejection of it makes Peter do it, which is what a kid would do. I think one of the things that solidifies this as one of the better arachnid boy entries is the inclusion of Tom Holland, who not only knocks it out of the park in terms of athletically with his quips and thwips and all of that stuff, but he actually looks like a child. In Avengers Civil War, he looks like he shouldn't be old enough to buy a Red Bull, and yet there he is with the Captain America shield. I mean, this man does not look like he should even be near a school, let alone inside it. Even with that though, I think the true heart of this lies in Michael Keaton's performance as Adrian Toomes, or the Vulture, because god damn, he's so compelling. In real time, we see Toomes get screwed over by the government and in turn screwed over by the concept of superheroes because of Tony Stark. One single moment forces that little switch to flick in his head that entirely changes the course of his life. And I mean, who isn't one minor inconvenience away from robbing the wealthy? Definitely not me, government, if you are watching this. And then add to that the insane twist scene. If you haven't seen this film, what are you doing here? Go watch it. Thor Ragnarok. I don't think anything at all needs to be said about Ragnarok. It would simply become a waste of oxygen in what is already becoming an incredibly big video. Sorry about that, it did not mean to be this long. Plainly put, it's one of the best films on this list, but for reasons I can't talk about yet, I'm putting it in A tier. I do think it set what is sort of an incredibly dangerous and alarming precedent for the rest of the MCU going forward, but I can't really talk about this until we get to some of the later films like Love and Thunder, and I feel like you're going to start getting angry at me if I start talking about these films out of order because I imagine you want it in chronological in terms of release. You're going to have to wait, okay? We'll go on to the next one. We're getting there soon. Black Panther. I remember coming out of the cinema watching this when I was at university and thinking truly it was one of the best films ever made. So coming back to this, I was what's known as in the business, shitting bricks. Because I don't think in any world this ever would have lived up to the lofty heights my dumb brain had set when I watched it originally. And annoyingly, that's true. In terms of origin stories set within the MCU, I think Black Panther is one of the best, if not the best. It not only has the difficult task of trying to modernise and revolutionise the traditional MCU story playbook, but add to that, it had to be done in a setting that has like non-existent representation in the world of box office titans. Like, how many movies can you think of that are set in Africa? I mean, in terms of the popcorn munching masses, there's not that many. The main problem I have with Black Panther is a problem that I have with a lot of MCU origin movies, or just MCU movies in general, is that it tries to do quite a lot at once. One of the most impactful scenes in the film is when Killmonger has just finished wrecking shop and has finally rocked up to Wakanda, challenging T'Challa to a ritual combat. We see T'Challa's family watch on as Killmonger just continues to wreck him over and over again, and the "is this your king" line will forever live in my head rent-free. Killmonger then proceeds to just yeet him over the edge of the waterfall, and oh my god, the main character of the film is dead, except 20 minutes later, he's alive again. There's no impact. Why not have this happen right at the start of the film? I mean, there was already a ritual fight right at the start. Why not have this be Killmonger's? Or, what I think they should have done, is why not split this into 2 movies? And also, it would have left the VFX team a little bit of time to sort out that bit in the Vibranian mine, because whoever's idea it was to have a scene in a dimly lit mine with 2 black suits with no lighting on, the PS2 graphics. Obviously, as everybody knows, Chadwick Boseman, I think is one of the best actors in the MCU. He's very good. Killmonger is also one of the best villains in the MCU, and just like I said with Vulture, you can actually sympathise with his plight because they actually do the groundwork of bigging him up, unlike some of the other villains. Denai Guerrera and Winston Duke are just, I think, absolutely underutilised, not only in this film, but just in the wider MCU. I think both of them are phenomenally good actors, and I hope from this point forward we get a little bit more of them. Either way, I'm putting it in B tier. Avengers Infinity War. 10 years, 18 movies, and a truly countless number of VFX artists all driven to madness, leading to this one moment. Going into the cinema when this film first came out sort of gave me the same impression as, like, you know when you're standing like out in the middle of nowhere and you sort of know in the air that it's about to rain, and then you look down and realise you're wearing shorts and you don't have a coat. You know something bad's about to happen, but you really don't know when. I don't know what you expect from a big-headed idiot with 5,000 subscribers. This film is good, we all know that. But I remember going to watch this with my sister and specifically saying, and this is going to sound like I'm lying, but I am not, specifically saying, if Loki and Heimdall died, I would have been a broken man. They were like the only two actual British people in the MCU that didn't have to speak with an American accent. So I felt a special connection to them. Then, like clockwork, that first scene happens, and I just remember looking at her and just pissing myself with laughter. Like, what? All the way back in Iron Man 3, when I first referenced the show and don't tell thing, this first scene in Infinity War is an absolute masterclass in it. Every piece of media that we've ever watched concerning anything Marvel related has bigged up the idea that our heroes are the best of the best. Just 10 minutes and 20 seconds into that, the entire illusion is shattered. Heimdall is dead, Loki has had his throat snapped, the Hulk got beaten so bad I thought Ed Norton was going to come out, and Thor just had to sort of stand on the side and watch like he's Adam 22. Instantly the stakes are raised way higher than any of us are comfortable with, because people could actually get whooped in this film. What's wild is when you try and consider how many characters are in this film and how seamlessly the Russos, Marcus and McFeely weave them all together. Iron Man 2 struggled with like 6. And not only that, they managed to weave together so many different styles, genres and vernaculars so seamlessly with incredibly simplistic techniques. For instance, they use traditional stationary big blockbustery cameras. That's definitely not the right terminology, but you know what I mean. I went to film school, Jesus. But then when we transition to the scenes later on with Thor and the Guardians, they use more handheld rigs. Like you can see the shaking and the trembling. It not only amplifies the comedic stylings of these funny people, but it also distinguishes it tonally from the rest of the film. Like when we can see the camera shaking, we know we can sit back and relax and inhale some sweet, sweet popcorn because we know no one's going to die. Yes? I only eat sweet popcorn and not salty or mixed. I'm British, what do you expect? Looking back on the entirety of the MCU, whenever people say things like, it's so over, or oh my god, we're back, it's normally dependent on the strength of the villain. Coming into this film with a decade of lore in their back pocket, you would have expected for the Russos and the gang would have naturally made the main character of the film Black Widow to make up for the fact that she's been messed over, Iron Man, Thor, Captain America. But it's Thanos. They ensured that throughout the film we could sympathise and understand the reasoning for this big bumpy-chinned man to be doing what he's doing. Like a normal MCU entry, we understand that the hero has this overarching goal that they want to achieve, and in this case, it's wiping out half of the known universe, and along the way there's tiny little things that they need to accomplish in order to get this done, and I guess in this case it's collecting the Infinity Stones like Pokemon gym badges whilst also wiping out the Avengers. And then by the end of the film, he's finally achieved his goal. We're happy about it because this guy's definitely the hero and you can see he's smiling. But no, what just happened? Everybody's dead. I was so confused by the ending. Even the little arachnid freak's not around anymore. No matter how many times I rewatched this film, every single second from when Thor crashes back into Wakanda to when you see that purple bumpy-chinned fellow smiling on a happy little countryside, it will wreck me. Anytime I see this scene, just thinking about it upsets me. If anyone puts this film in anything but S tier, they need to be detained. Actually, no, it can't be an S tier. It needs to be this one. Hang it in the Louvre. All right, I am actually going to admit something here. Do you know that post-credit scene where Nick Fury and Maria Hill get snapped and we actually see the real like world impact of it? And then the page falls down and a little symbol flashes up. I'm going to admit something now. I thought that was Deadpool. because at that point in my life, I didn't realise that I needed glasses to see the screen, so I couldn't see what was happening. Ant-Man and the Wasp. Any film that had to do the dirty work of following along after Infinity War, no matter how unbelievably funny and good it is, was always going to struggle. Once our stupid little brains were shown that this was the quality we could have been getting all along, it was ropes from there. That being said, Ant-Man and the Wasp is so much better than I remember. In my original list, it's down in the dregs with the Incredible Hulk because truly I thought this movie was incredibly forgettable, but it was an incredibly good palate cleanser after the nightmare that we just had to witness. And also, it's incredibly on brand for the whole Ant-Man series, that whilst Tony Stark is getting a planet punched into his face, Scott Lang is learning close-up magic. So I think the fact that they set this tangential to Infinity War was a masterstroke. Although I think it is one of the most underrated MCU projects because people always moan about how bad it is and how boring it is. You can clearly see it's still nowhere near as good as the first film. Potentially because some of the better aspects of the first Ant-Man film were actually the ideas of the previous director, Edgar Wright, and now that that director's not helped working on this film, it's all gone downhill. But that being said, I could totally watch a 4-hour film with Paul Rudd, Luis Pena and Randall Park. Please bring back Luis and Randall into something Marvel related, please. It's solidly a B-tier film. Captain Marvel. I remember watching this on the same day as Shazam and coming out and thinking, wow, I've definitely just wasted an entire day. And I feel like most of the general population felt the exact same way. However, I do not think it's as bad as I remember. It's still not great, but it's not abhorrent. Plainly put, I think this is a bog standard MCU origin film that I think should have come out between 2008 and 2014. But it came out in 2019 because I imagine some of the truly abhorrent higher-ups at Marvel didn't think a female-led movie would do as well in the box office. Which, considering you make films about big purple and blue dudes, how is a female-led film so out of the question? How is that the fantasy part in this? Chronologically, it's actually supposed to be the second MCU film, so it sort of makes sense that it does fall into the same traps that those earlier films did, but it also came out in 2019, so you'd think they would have cleaned that act up now. You can't really use that as an excuse of, oh, it's bad because it's supposed to be as bad as the early stuff. No. It also doesn't help that another fellow British person, Jude Law, is absolutely the most predictable twist villain and unbelievably unforgettable. I watched it yesterday and I don't know what his name is. What a shock that the British man with the glowy yellow eyes is the bad guy all along. I don't know how we could have seen that coming. Adding to that, unlike the Marvels, which we'll get to in a bit, Captain Marvel in this film is incredibly annoying and arrogant. Again, it's understandable because it's their first film and they haven't been humbled yet, just like Thor, Steve and Iron Man. But we've already gone through that awkward phase in the MCU where we've got through all the boring origin stories and now we've had Infinity War and now we've got to go back to that. It's sort of... The chemistry between Brie Larson and Samuel L. Jackson are the absolute standout parts of this film, as is Samuel L. Jackson's chemistry with Goose, who I think is one of the most underrated characters in the MCU. Bring me more of that cat. What's a flirkin? If this film had come out 8 years prior, I think it would have been remembered more favourably, but I'm just going to put it at D. Avengers Endgame. Similarly to when we just covered Infinity War, I don't think you need this dum-dum to tell you how good Endgame is. Shockingly, a film that grossed over $2 billion is quite good. I don't think it's as good as Infinity War, mind you, but that being said, the last 40 minutes of that film rocked me so hard I think I left a piece of myself in that little cinema in Wales, like a Horcrux from Harry Potter. I'll never be the same wacky waving inflatable tube man brought to life by a witch's curse ever again. That being said though, Endgame is absolutely one of the better films that the MCU has produced, and thanks to the Fantastic Four of the Russos, Marcus and McFeely, it manages to bring a level of humanity to these superhuman people. Like, why am I feeling empathy and like I know what Captain America's talking about when he's just lost a fight against an intergalactic purple dude and half the universe has been wiped out? Clearly I get up to that on an everyday basis. Whereas Infinity War, in my opinion, is the better movie, Endgame is a love letter to a decade of Marvel movies, with a truly mental amount of fan service and cameos that I think fundamentally changed the way that people looked at MCU and is potentially the reason why people think the MCU has fallen off the face of a cliff. But we'll get to that in my big rant at the end of the video. I mean, you can look at the timestamps, there's quite a big chunk down there. Clearly I'm not talking about each film individually, but I'm spoiling it. Endgame worked as the perfect jumping off point for a lot of fans finally satisfied with a decade of loose ends being tied up. But not only that, it served as an off-ramp for a lot of the cast, which left a sorry taste in most people's mouths, because what the hell does that mean for the rest of the MCU and the rest of the Avengers going forward? Who do we even have left? Like, you would think maybe Spider-Man and Peter Quill, but they've also been doing this for like nearly 8 years at this point. Who the hell is it going to be? It absolutely cannons to the top of S tier for me. Spider-Man Far From Home. After finally reaching the depths of space, seeing alien creatures mowed down in their droves as burning wreckages of a civilization long gone trembles in the background, we finally embarked on our most treacherous journey yet, a school field trip throughout mainland Europe. Far From Home picks up directly after Endgame, finally giving us answers to the questions of, hey, what happens when half of existence just suddenly starts appearing again? And in typical John Watts Spidey fashion, it does so with a skip in its step, not letting us dwell on the truly existential nightmares that those questions pose. Like, what happens if you were in an aeroplane when you got snapped? Or what if you were in a building that's not a building anymore? Would you get unsnapped and suddenly start falling from the sky? Or would you, like, be in concrete now? Although I'm a big fan of the Spidey trilogy, do not get angry at me here. I do think Far From Home is the weakest of the trilogy, and then again, that's not me saying Far From Home is a bad movie. It's still one of the better films in the MCU. I just think compared to No Way Home and Homecoming, stylistically and narratively, it doesn't really stand out. In Homecoming, Peter is an eager idiot that makes a lot of mistakes only to have a new piece of technology that's been given to him taken away by the end of the second act. And in Far From Home, Peter is an eager idiot that makes a lot of mistakes only to have a new piece of technology that's been given to him taken away sort of around the midpoint of the second act. However, that being said, there are still some unbelievably good things in this film. Obviously, Jake Gyllenhaal as Quentin Beck and Mysterio is an absolute delight from minute one, and his whole corny "I'm from a different universe" thing is so good that they're taking the piss out of the absurdity that is the world around them. Also, the chemistry between Tom Holland and Jake Gyllenhaal rivals that of Tom Holland and RDJ, so I think that also works because Peter's obviously being taken advantage of right after his mentors passed away. Additionally, all the illusion stuff, oh my god, it's so good. And I think it's so good that Mysterio is that good of a manipulator. He manages to manipulate the audience into thinking, hang on a minute, which of these illusions are real and which aren't? And then he gets hit by a train. Although I was being an idiot earlier saying how it's narratively similar, but I do like that we get to see Peter do Spider-Man things like web swing, and also we get to see Peter grow as not only Peter Parker the person without Iron Man, but Spider-Man without Iron Man. You get to see how he's obviously changed after fighting a big purple alien dude in space. It's still an incredibly good entry into the canon, so it's obviously going in at A. So don't shout at me, Spider-Man fans, I'm only a boy. A tiny little boy. Actually, I'm 20. Black Widow. Finally, after years of being looked at creepily by a true catalogue of men in the MCU, Scarlett Johansson finally gets a swan song and gets a solo film that I imagine she's been waiting for about a decade. It's just a shame that it probably should have also come out a decade ago. Black Widow suffers the same pitfalls that I think Captain Marvel fell into, and I imagine quite a lot of MCU origin stories will going forward, and that is, just because a film is set in the past doesn't mean that it needs to stylistically be the same as those films and have the same problems as those films. Similarly to Captain Marvel and Ant-Man and the Wasp, I also think Black Widow suffers after being one of the films released after the whole Infinity War Endgame situation. Once we've been shown that we could sort of have this stuff, go into films that look like this again sort of leaves a sorry taste in your mouth. It's by no means a terrible movie. It brings a depth to Natasha's character I think we should have had a long time ago, and it's nice to see her and her family. It's not blowing any minds. It's probably cool to have on in the background whilst you're knitting, drawing, or playing Minecraft, which I imagine a lot of you are probably doing right now. There's a creeper behind you, watch out! It's just when Black Widow came off the heels of the films before it, the difference in quality between the two feels quite chasmic. Yelena and Alexei are standouts for me, and it sort of detracts from the point of the film in the first place, which I guess was supposed to be Scarlett Johansson's swan song and be like, finally she's been given a film, but then Marvel have just used it as a vehicle to get people interested in future MCU projects, which I understand was how things were in the good old days and also how Scarlett Johansson was introduced, but it just feels hollow. And now I want to watch the Thunderbolts asterisk because I want to see more of David Harbour and Florence Pugh. But I'm just falling into the same traps. Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. I feel like I may have to do a separate tier list within a tier list for like MCU origin solo films, but this is definitely towards the very top, if not at the top. I think it just pips Black Panther. Shang-Chi is without a doubt one of the better entries into the Marvel canon after Endgame and Infinity War. It manages to modernise and revolutionise the typical MCU playbook in a way that Black Panther did before it. The fight scenes and choreography are mesmerising, and when compared to what we just saw in Black Widow, it feels like going from watching black and white movies to witnessing the birth of a galaxy. Simu Liu is phenomenal in this, not only comedically and athletically, but I think his confrontation with Wenwu in the final act showcases a dramatic side to him that I wasn't aware that he had when I've been watching Kim's Convenience for like the past few years. It's absolutely an A-tier film, and it sort of fills me with confidence with the MCU going forward because Shang-Chi and Simu are both incredibly strong, and I think will be able to guide the MCU in the way that RDJ and Iron Man did. But that being said, after watching so many of these films in a row, it does devastate me how formulaic this thing is. There's so much cool stuff that happens over the course of this film, both stylistically and filmically. Like I mentioned earlier, the fight scenes are so cool, and it does one of my favourite tropes with fight scenes, and that's when you use the environment around you to your advantage. Like when the bus scene and the scaffold scene, it's so good. And also the post-credit scene, which still absolutely confuses me. I imagine it was supposed to be a link to He Who Shall Not Be Named, but who knows what they're going to do with it now. But even with all that incredibly cool stuff and the idea of building familial tension and breaking the cycle of abuse, why does it end with a big kaiju battle? I haven't mentioned any of the MCU shows that would have started propping up in our collective timelines around this point, but this is also one of my biggest problems with those as well, with the obvious one being Moon Knight, which was a look at a superhero struggling with dissociative identity disorder, but then it ended with a big CGI battle between a bird and a crocodile, or an alligator. I actually don't know the difference between the two. Obviously, before going into this process, I knew the MCU formula was a thing, but it wasn't until I watched all of these films back to back that I started to realise how obvious it was. Like, we all know when we're eating a sausage what nightmares lay within that sausage, but it isn't until you step one foot into the sausage factory and actually witness it being made that you're like, maybe I shouldn't eat sausages anymore. That being said, let's go on a collective journey together into the sausage factory to see how it's being made. Eternals. Okay, do not shout at me here. Again, Jeremy, put that flipping pitchfork down. But I do think Eternals is one of the better releases post-Infinity War and Endgame. Am I dead? Has your collective anger killed me? But I think it also is a fantastic showcase at some of the symptomatic problems with the current state of the MCU. They packed this bad boy with so much Oscar bait that I guess they completely forgot that they needed to write an ending to the film. It's like they thought if they packed it with enough shiny things, we'd just be okay with that. The first half of this movie I really enjoyed, even if I thought it would have been a bit better if it didn't have so many random flashbacks, or just set this film up to be prehistoric or ancient superheroes completely disconnected from the mainline timeline of the MCU. Then you could have avoided all the annoying timeline headaches that this thing produced. And considering the main villain that you were trying to introduce at the time, their whole shtick was time travel, this could have worked a lot better than, I don't know, introducing him in a fucking Ant-Man film. I still do find it incredibly funny that however many films we've had since then, we still haven't referenced the big hand that came out of the which I know isn't like a rare opinion. Like, whilst I've been recording this today, they have addressed it. Like, it's in the Captain America trailer. But I think if that had happened in real life, someone would have mentioned it by now. But this is what I was on about when I was talking about systematic problems within the Marvel machine. Because so many of these projects are produced congruently, it's quite hard for the writers' rooms to communicate. Because can you imagine, say if you're writing the next Captain Marvel film and you randomly got a post-it note saying, oh yeah, by the way, midway through our film, a hand comes out of the earth. You sort of have to work that in. You'd be understandably quite annoyed. This is probably one of the main reasons that Marvel and Disney has both slowed production of the Marvel Beast to an absolute halt at the moment, prioritising quality over quantity. But I guess it didn't matter for any of these films going forward. Well, all except for Spider-Man: No Way Home. Okay. I'm walking about a bit here because you're going to get angry with me because you can probably see how little I talk about this film. Okay, this film is very good, but I'm quite annoyed that it came out in this period. Not because, again, it's not a bad film, but because in order to go on my big rant that I'm about to go on, I sort of wanted to include the previous film in my big rant, but now it's sort of split up the rant. I don't think you need another white guy with questionable facial hair to tell you how good Spider-Man No Way Home is. I think we all know that by now. It was quite cool when all the Spider-Man showed up. It's more comic accurate because Peter's now depressed. In order to continue what I was currently talking about, I need to get back to my rant. So, it is an S film. It's up there. It's quite good. And as you can tell with how long's left in this video, we're about to motor through quite a lot of films very fast. So, prepare yourself. Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, Thor, Love and Thunder, Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, The Marvels. That was a lot of words. I know this is going to be absolutely infuriating for you for me having to talk about all of these in one big go, but do you understand how jarring it would have been if I'd set up an argument and then gone, Black Panther is an alright film, argument continues again, Guardians of the Galaxy is an okay film, argument continues again. It would have been quite annoying. Here are my ratings for the films. Bang, 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 bang. I think that's enough bangs. One of the things I've been consistently repeating after the films post-Infinity War and Endgame is the perceived gulf in quality between these two films and the films that we've been greeted with. I mean, there's obvious exceptions to the rule, but it's definitely apparent. Once we've been greeted with a film of this quality, after years of drudging through films like Iron Man 2 and Thor the Dark World, it's very hard to go back to films like Thor Love and Thunder and Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania, which are both inherently terrible, terrible movies. The previous decade of Marvel was them slowly drip-feeding composite parts of a wider narrative, or in the analogy that I'm going to use from here on out, ingredients to a larger recipe. Watching Infinity War and Endgame was like Marvel finally giving us the most delicious piece of chocolate cake. One of the ones that's so good but you can't quite remember where you got it from, so you spend your entire life searching for it like the Holy Grail. But looking back on films like Captain Marvel, Black Panther, Iron Man 3 and pretty much a majority of the MCU, it felt like Marvel was slowly giving us ingredients to make that cake, and then finally once we got Endgame and Infinity War, they mushed it all together for us. And it was a more enjoyable experience. We all collectively worked our way through those films, and sure, some of them on their own are fantastic standalone dishes, but when you compare it to Infinity War and Endgame, the gulf is cosmically massive. So after experiencing that, it's no wonder that going forward we expected every film to be chocolate cake, but then we'd rock up to the theatre and we'd be greeted with a solitary egg or a few specks of flour. I came here for cake! Audience expectations were raised to such unfathomable heights after Tony snapped his last snap that whatever followed on from that was always going to feel like the MCU fell off a cliff. And I know, I'm not giving the MCU an excuse to, even though they spend millions and billions of dollars on these films and they're still awful. Sure, Far From Home was a great epilogue to the Infinity War saga, but should we really have to drudge through 45 other Black Widow films before we get to eat a cake again? This point is exacerbated so perfectly by the next film, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. As I said earlier, Doctor Strange is one of my favourite MCU entries in general, purely because it tries to do something entirely different to the traditional formula. And I remember hearing the title Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness and going, hang on a minute, that sounds incredibly similar to one of my favourite books and all of that Lovecraftian nightmare fuel. And then also we heard along the grapevine that this film was going to be a horror film, so of course my expectations pinged into the stratosphere. This was only furthered when we started hearing rumblings of all the cameos that were going to be in this film and how John Krasinski was going to be Reed Richards. We were all on high alert, like, what the hell is happening here? But then, as we slowly got closer and closer to the film coming out, we started to hear drippings from reputable sources that the film was absolute nightmare fuel and truly horrendous, which shockingly influenced my expectations when I went into the film. I remember coming out of it and going, that is potentially one of the worst movies I've ever seen. So do you want to know how shocked I was when I watched it the other day and it was actually really good? It's like a solid A. Obviously, it's not the greatest film ever released and the stuff with Wanda is still really weird, but it's a lot better than I remember, and I think that's why I've ranked it so high. All of the awful leak culture that is present within the bubbling cesspool that is social media built our expectations to such unfathomable levels, and then continued to actually chop down our expectations when they told us that the movie wasn't good. Why does one person saying something on the internet influence me so much? As soon as people realised that John Krasinski's and all of the Illuminati's whole deal was to be mowed down in a few minutes for like comedic effect, we all felt cheated. Marvel was understandably taking the mick out of our own expectations after the cameo fest that was Endgame, but in doing so, raised our expectations. And then after all of that, they had the absolute audacity for the post-credit scene to have Charlize Theron rocking up in Amazon ass Halloween makeup. Who the hell is this character? What does any of it mean? It's like Harry Styles at the end of The Eternals or Brett Goldstein at the end of Thor Love and Thunder. And don't get me wrong, I love Brett Goldstein. You're just whacking another popular celebrity in a role to try and get me to dredge through all of that shit again. It's so annoying. The only one of these that actually intrigued me was Mahershala Ali as Blade at the end of The Eternals. But that film has been through such development hell that by the time it actually comes out, Kit Harington probably won't even be in it. Realistically, when you go back and look at some of the earlier MCU entries, you can tell Marvel had no idea where the story was going. But now we've been given a satisfying enough conclusion that ties those loose threads together. Going back to the era of loose threads Marvel again, where they clearly don't know what they're doing, is baffling. Like I said earlier, why did you use ScarJo's Marvel send-off as a way to sneak in more characters for us to care about in the future, opposed to celebrating her presence within the cinematic universe? Why did you use Black Panther 2, a film that was supposed to be a celebration of Chadwick Boseman, as a vehicle to bring in a character for a Disney Plus series that none of us are going to watch in order to set up a young Avengers film with probably Brett Goldstein as the villain that none of us want to watch? This feeds nicely into a thing I mentioned earlier when talking about Ragnarok, and that is leaning too heavily into goofs and gaffs. After the rip-roaring success of Ragnarok, Marvel thought they'd stumbled upon their next golden goose egg, taking a serious character and for no explicit reason, making them suddenly a massive idiot. It worked here, so we gotta put it in everything else. But the reason Ragnarok worked wasn't because Thor was a doofus or that Korg was in it. It was a satisfying branch of character development for Thor to progress on. Obviously it was going to be a little weird after his dad has died. He's found out his entire family legacy is a lie, and his sister that he didn't know he had broke his hammer. But Love and Thunder took all of those cool ideas and just threw up all over them. It makes it all the more infuriating when there is clearly quite a cool film in there. Like the relationship between Thor and Jane and her experience with cancer was such a cool angle. Why not have this be the crux of the film rather than the "he's right behind me, isn't he" shenanigans, and then having Bale as Gore the God Butcher? It's so annoying. This then goes on to highlight another rampant problem within the Marvel making machine, and that is just absolutely messing about directors and writers before films have even been created. Obviously, Taika Waititi was always going to be given the reins to the next Thor film after the immense success of Ragnarok, but I imagine his inevitable sequel to the film probably didn't go the way he wanted it to go. In the first 20 minutes of the film, he had to find a satisfying way to suddenly make Thor not fat anymore and deal with the Guardians of the Galaxy, because the mere presence of the Asgardians of the Galaxy that were teased at the end of Endgame unrealistically raised the expectations for that film. This is exactly the same as what happened with Wakanda Forever, which not only had to deal with the passing of Chadwick Boseman, but also this film had to find someone to pass the mantle of Black Panther to that was both satisfying for the audience and also the higher-ups at Marvel, who I imagine planned a lot around the character of Black Panther. Again, this leads on to another nightmare fuel film, Ant-Man 3, which for some reason had to be Marvel's way to introduce what they thought was going to be the next big bad in the form of He Who Shall Not Be Named. But the sheer to do this not only made that villain so utterly impotent because he got bested by a bunch of ants, but also ruins the whole heart and soul of Ant-Man. His whole power is the fact that, wow, he's small and now he big. And we know he's small because a car is bigger than him. But when you take Ant-Man and put him into a place that none of us go through on our daily commute in the form of the quantum realm, how the hell are we supposed to know how big and small he is? That eliminates his entire thing. Like, there's a scene right at the end when Scott and Cassie are supposed to both be massive, but I couldn't tell that they were massive. I still do think it was such a missed opportunity sending them all into the quantum realm too. I think it should have just been Scott and Luis. And yes, I think it should have been Luis that went in there rather than the recast person who they were just using to set up the Young Avengers. God, this film's bad. Guardians 3 is by far and away the absolute standout of all of this big chunk of films that I'm talking about now. But that's because James Gunn had a narrative from the get-go that he was allowed to complete. And he didn't have to deal with any outrageous curveballs thrown at him by the dude in the baseball hat. It's the most complete and self-encompassed trilogy within the MCU that could probably stand out on its own, along there with Captain America and Spider-Man. And it still manages to deal with more horrifying topics than what was supposed to be the actual horror film. Oh yeah, I guess the Marvels is okay too. The scene with the Flurkins, very good, and actually made me laugh out loud, which I didn't expect going into it. But I felt ashamed for doing that. Deadpool and Wolverine. We're down to the final film. All that stands between me and freedom from ever having to look at a bunch of blonde muscly men throwing explosions at each other ever again. All that stood in my way was what many are claiming to be the potential saviour of Marvel. But now the journey was almost complete. What would I even do with myself? Am I the same person as when I started this so many weeks ago? I mean, look at me. What is that? now that I've stepped inside the sausage factory and I've sort of seen the MCU for what it is, maybe it's time for a clean slate. Maybe it's time for a new look. What is an incredibly fitting way to end this monumental task that took years off of my life and gave me immense ridicule from all of my loved ones for laughing at my facial hair. It's only a fitting end to start this with a film that's so heavily connected to what started my love affair with Marvel in the first place. I can't tell you how many times I watched all the 20th Century Fox Marvel films. Hang on, I'm just gonna go get the DVDs. These are the only ones I could find, but do you know how many times I watched this film? Or this one? God, I haven't seen these boxes in like 10 years. Oh my god, look how messed up this box is, by the way. Shows how much I've watched this. Oh my god, it's got one of these things. Oh my god, issue 4. They're all pretty terrible. Le Divorce. I don't know any of... Oh, Daredevil. I don't think I ever watched that. X-Files, Season 7. Oh my god, The Simpsons, Season 3! So that shows how old this is. You know a film's good when the only quote on the back it says is awesome entertainment, and it's from The Sun. The newspaper, not the big orb. So, let's embark on this final journey, I guess.
Wow, that was quite good.
I just want to say thank you for the insane reception for my last few videos, because when I last uploaded I had 700 subscribers and I have a little bit more than that now. And also, I apologise, you may have seen the poll that I did and you're like, this video is none of the videos in the poll, but I had a little thing called insane writer's block after having nearly 180, now I think it's like 200,000 views on my channel in a very short period, and I didn't know what to do. I thought all those video ideas were boring when I started writing them, so I'm very sorry if you were looking forward to that video for a very long time. I hope you still enjoyed this one. I'm imagining this is not going to get the insane amount of views that my previous 2 videos did, but if you're still here watching this, thank you for your support and thank you for listening to a stupid idiot talk about films. This is very different to what I normally do, but I'm trying new things. I can't just be angry man who has a go at scams all the time. I do other things with my life. I don't want to be eternally depressed. Now that we've dealt with this nightmare fuel, I normally like to end the video properly with like bloopers from something that's happened in the video, but shockingly, talking for nearly 4 hours in one sitting, there weren't many comedic outtakes. But I will greet you with this absolute nightmare fuel. When I was shaving, I decided to see what I'd look like with a mustache, so here you go. It's awful.
I look like I should have a cop show. Abhorrent. It's absolutely awful. Ugh.